While I was preparing this talk and being uncertain whether the administrative chain that interpolates me as a subject would issue my passport and allow me to travel here, I thought I developed a profound understanding of the ways in which bureaucracy calls for a radically embodied self. While waiting before the law to receive my passport and not getting answers to numerous phone calls, connecting my heartbeat to the dial tone and the anticipation to a voice on the other end of the phone call, and my voice changing from trembling and pleading to a forceful baritone, I understood that the abstraction and embodiment of the subject, as it gets inscribed in bureaucratic quagmires, requires a radical exaggeration of the body's psychosomatic responses. It calls for a body that experiences pain and pleasure, a pulsating anxiety, and a jubilant pleasure before the law. Thus, the administration of the subject does not take place at the expense of the illumination of the body, but precisely through its forceful exaggeration. In Kafka's parable Before the Law, Joseph K. spends a lifetime in front of the gate to enter the law. But his entry is repeatedly prevented by the gatekeeper, who has a sharp-pointed nose, a fur coat, and a thin Tartar's beard. As Joseph K. grows old, he shrinks while the gatekeeper grows taller. I quote Kafka. Finally, his eyesight grows weak, and he does not know whether things are really dark around him or whether his eyes are merely deceiving him. But he recognizes now in the darkness illumination which breaks inextinguishably out of the gateway to the law. Now he no longer has much time to live. Before his death, he gathers in his head all his experiences of the entire time up into one question, which he has not yet put to the gatekeeper. He waives him, since he can no longer lift up his stiffening body. The gatekeeper has to bend way down to him, for the great difference has changed things considerably to the disadvantage of the man. What do you still want to know? Asks the gatekeeper. You are insatiable. Everyone strives after the law, says the man. So how is it that in these many years no one except me has requested entry? The gatekeeper sees that the man is already dying, and in order to reach his diminishing sense of hearing, he shouts at him. Here no one else can gain entry, since this entrance was assigned only to you. I'm going to close it now. End of quote. As disempowering as it might be to wait at the gate of the law, Joseph K.'s anticipation is both a spatial and temporal deferral of the law that might open up radical possibilities for the subjectivization. This temporal before maintains the law as an exteriority, an object, and an immanent authority, against which the time of dwelling posits a livability, possible only for as long as the appearance of the law is postponed. But the law is topology as well. It is a localizable space that comes only before and after, but never coincides with the subject's presence. What interests me, however, is not so much the way in which the abstract law renders itself powerful because the decaying body of Joseph K. spends a lifetime at its gate, but the way in which the law renders itself visible, an image and an apparition that never fully materializes. Thus, it constitutes a phantasm. As his sight diminishes, law appears to Joseph K. as a form, an illumination which breaks inextinguishably out to the gateway of the law, to which he is denied entry. The image through which the law renders itself visible is in turn governed by a set of conventions. This is the Derridian question posed in relation to Kafka's parable. What are the laws that define the narrative itself as literature? We can extend the question to images. How do we recognize images? What are the conventions that define something as an image? When does the law render itself visible in the form of an image? How do we confront the visual that, according to Georges de Huberman, defies the visible and yet is not invisible? Are we inside images? Are we outside of them? Or do we spend a lifetime at their threshold, neither able to leave or to enter?
The empire projects itself as an image, first and foremost through architecture. It permanently scars a landscape by building upright standing structures in an attempt to reproduce the provinces in its own image. Architecture is a structure of edification, but edification embedded in the projection of the imperial power marks the other as ultimately not entirely edifiable and as always lacking the perfectly upright posture that would characterize the imperial subject. The empire's image is both a phantasm calling for identification with it, but also an otherness that cannot be completely accommodated within the psychic economy of the subject. Architecture simultaneously reflects and performs the ambiguity of the phantasmic projection of recognition and misrecognition, identification and disidentification with the site from which the power emanates. The day after the battle is for the administration of things. The Tsar calls for his master planners, artists who import ornamental motifs, and rushes in cartographers to redraft the existing maps. But the architectural mirroring of administrative imperial structures emanating from the center onto the provinces emerges as a slippage, an homage, a bastard child of the original, a distorted image. Thus, the projection of the imperial power as an image is a flawed one. In the longue durée through which the image of power travels from the center to the provinces, what remains of it is merely its shell, sedimentation, an ornament that betrays its original mission. The architecture of the provinces repeats and doubles the imperial glory, but this uncanny doubling produces an abyss, a hollowness that refuses to fit back into the image through which the power attempts to render itself visible. If the relationship demanded between the empire and its subjects is one of love and fidelity, architecture is the law that institutes this bondage. Two towns are separated by a gorge and a now sealed border. I was born and grew up in one and had only heard stories from my grandfather from where his family came from in the early 20th century about the other. Kars, a town in eastern Anatolia, or what my grandfather persistently calls Western Armenia, was of strategic importance for the Russian Empire in several consecutive wars with the Ottomans. 1828, 1855, 1877, and World War I. The town became the center of the governorate of eastern provinces after the War of the Crimea, when the Russian Empire took hold of it in 1878. The specific architecture of the provincial center that developed throughout the late 19th and early 20th century was to house the bureaucratic organs of the empire in order to administer the daily lives of its citizens. This architecture of black and pink porous tooth, whose austere forms were occasionally punctured by delicate weldwork or wooden ornamentation, emerged as the replica of 19th century Russian imperial architecture. Yet, its raw materiality, its fragile resistance towards delicate handwork because of the precarious porosity of the stone, betrayed its infidelity to the original. 19th century imperial architecture of Tsarist Russia in turn had developed as an amalgam of the structure of traditional Russian hut, which was called izbushka, and French Belle Époque neoclassical elements imported by Peter the Great that dedicated Europhile who forced his boyards to shave their barbaric beards. The stone houses often had 2 stories and a wooden balcony, most of them located on the slope of the hills and extending towards the top. It is these hills that define the topography of the town. Right after securing Kars as its stronghold in eastern Anatolia in 1878, the empire brought in architects and urban planners to transform the southern plateau of the city into a new town surrounded by walls with multiple towers. A new Russian church was immediately built together with single-level spacious shops, most of them with black tooth and tin roofs, often painted in white or pink. In official Armenian historiography, one reads, "The union of Kars with Russia was of a major progressive significance. Similar to Eastern Armenia's early reunification with Russia, this part of the country also started enjoying progress in economy and culture. Law and order was instituted, and the inhabitants became exposed to incomparably higher and more developed Russian culture." End of quote. Gyumri, the town I grew up in, is separated from Kars with a gorge, a river, and now a blockaded border. From the very first day when the Russian troops marched into the Ararat Valley in 1805, they conquered the town from Persia and used it as a strategic point to occupy the entire valley as well as expand towards the east, the provinces of the Ottoman Empire. The words of the 19th century Enlightenment writer and thinker Khachatur Abovyan still have ghostly reverberations. Blessed be the hour when the Russian foot stepped on the Armenian soil. Kars and Gyumri shared an often quite mobile population of Armenians, Greeks, Jews, and Yazidis, and in many ways Kars was built as a replica of Gyumri. After the Russian conquest, the city was named Alexandropol after Alexander II. It is here that most of the population of Kars immigrated between 1915 and 1920 during the massacres. As I grew up in Gyumri, I witnessed its many layers, the Russian, the Soviet, the post-Soviet, converging and clashing as if it was a battle of various pasts enacted upon architecture. However, this symbolic battle was not merely one between various ideologies of the past and ideals for the future. A natural disaster in 1988 came to the aid in the symbolic battle by erasing much of the Soviet landscape and exposing the 19th century Tsarist town in its full nakedness. But I never suspected that Gyumri had a double in the most uncanny sense until I arrived to Kars in 2006. And it was not the childhood memories of my grandfather that I had already filtered through a critical distance and disidentification, but the very materiality of the city that arrested me before I could even enter into its semiotic structure. The familiarity of the place was not based on associations triggered through the empirically constructed space that go along the lines of "this reminds me of," but the horror of the double. In Freud's sense, the uncanny is an aesthetic notion, a notion that pertains to the quality of things, feelings, triggered by the quality of images. He says that the uncanny is that class of the terrifying which leads back to something long known to us, once very familiar, which is heimlich in German. But the familiar is stretched to such an extent that it ambiguously reaches its opposite, the unheimlich, in which the prefix "an" is the token of repression. The doubling of the two towns, not only in the sense of architectural sameness, but also the exactitude of its afterlife, creates double ghosts. The ghost of the imperial repression, and imperial repetition as well, and the ghostly repetition of this ghost in the afterlife of the two towns. I'm being unnecessarily complicated here. But the uncanny is also profoundly connected to narcissism in that the doubling springs from self-love, from the desire to project oneself to eternity. Afterlife, ghost, soul, you name it. The power of the empire renders itself as a phantasmagoric image through architectural doubling, a Narcissus absorbed with its own image in a perpetual present that demands love and fidelity from its subjected others. But this ambiguity with doubles, as Freud has been telling us, is that they turn from reassurances of eternity to the ghastly harbingers of death.
In You Tell Me, architectural historian Jane offers sight writing, a spatial narrative constructed through topographical fiction and existing visual codes within a space informed by subjective experiences. But this space itself is never a given, it comes into being through the embodied experience. Sight writing is not writing about spaces, but writing spaces, engaging with images through their own intrinsic spatiality and materiality. It is not an ekphrasis, but an exegesis that opens up the images to the possibility of seeing and unknowing, and knowing and unseeing. Exegesis does not form a discourse that invents the object in its own image, but if need be, resigns before it. Resigns before the image that exits both the interpretation and its own materiality. The topography of the image is not the topography of our empirical space. It is a dreamlike topography in which various spatialities and temporalities converge, overlap, and clash. It's a dream work in a Freudian sense, understood as a condensed space, time. in which sheds are put together. The space of the image and the space of the dream work collide in yet another sense. They both offer visual intensity that is comprised of contradictory, clashing, and overlapping composites, and yet take the referent as a material for the dream image work.
Power demands its material support. The reflective surfaces of skyscrapers conceal their structure and materiality with the promise of infinite virtualization. Their substance appears as nothing but their own appearance, the surface that reflects the surrounding with the effect of infinite regression and mirroring. As a hall of mirrors, it projects a sublime presence of effortlessness. The skyscraper is a myth of a historic necessity and a natural order of things, two sides of the same coin. The postmodern skyscraper projects itself onto other surfaces while being constituted by these surfaces as a holograph, a pure transparency of instant materialization and dematerialization. The skyscraper is connected with other structures through bridges and underpasses. It is a pure network that epitomizes the network structure of the only pertinent ideology of our times, that of the global financial system. I arrived to Westin Bonaventure Hotel, downtown LA, and entered the labyrinthine maze of the atrium through a half-concealed and lateral entrance on Figueroa Street that provides a closure to the hotel rather than an opening. The lobby seems to provide the only foundation upon which the four disjointed glass towers hover, suspended between the ground and the sky. The lobby is also the only walkable space in the entire structure where otherwise disjointed parts are connected through dozens of elevators and escalators. One can go up in an elevator in each of the four disconnected towers that spring up from the atrium. In an attempt to restore the coordinates of bodily orientation, each tower is color-coded to guide the visitor to hotel rooms. Each tower has one and single referent, Los Angeles itself with its sprawling network structure. Each and every time I'm compelled to document my journey to the 24th floor and back to the ground floor lobby. Each journey is different since the elevator will stop on different floors to carry other guests, thus the rhythm of the video will change upon the stoppages. In addition, there are at least 20 possibilities to make different videos. Each cylindrical elevator provides 5 possible views, and between 4 elevators it makes 20, let alone the possibilities of filming during different times of the day. The journey consists of 2 parts. Firstly, the elevator shoots through the ceiling of the enclosed atrium in what seems to be a much faster pace because of the closeness of the walls and other structural elements to the glass shell of the elevator. The pace of the journey seems slower, and the position of the onlooker becomes panoptical once one leaves the lower circle of the material structure and appears suspended between the ground and the sky, surrounded by the sprawling city. The downward journey is more dramatic and reverses the dialectic between openness and closure, the journey culminating in the inferno of the hotel lobby with the elevator literally splashing into the lake. I'm constantly in the image. The image that projects its glittery surface is a phantasmagoric space of inclusion, yet it excludes those who inhabit the other side of downtown LA, the homeless, the drug addicts, alcoholics, former inmates, drag queens, and so on, who dwell under the bridges and in the riverbed. Yet, while in the image, I want to externalize it, to spit it out of myself, to regain my body that has been violently turned into a reflection. It has been deprived of its capacity to move freely and is being carried through automated devices such as elevators and escalators. Or rather, I want to eject myself out of the image by putting the burden of seeing on the camera eye. While I'm between the visual trap I submitted myself to and the critical distance I force myself to inhabit, I recall Frederick Jameson's paragraphs on Westin Bonaventure. For Jameson, locates a radical rupture with modernist architecture that inhabits the surrounding cityscape with its utopian promise as a disjunctive proposition for a different aesthetics of living than the surrounding environment can accommodate in the present. Instead, John Portman's 1977 building, West in Bonaventure, what Jameson says, seeks to speak the very language of the surrounding environment, its lexicon and syntax, and acts as a populist insertion into the city fabric. As a total space, it corresponds to a new collective practice, something like the practice of a new historically original kind of hypercrowd. End of quote. The escalators and elevators that occupy a special place in Jameson's description, as well as in Portman's architecture, epitomize what Jameson calls a dialectical heightening of the process of narrativization of architecture that the visitor has to fulfill. He continues, "It seems to me that not only do the escalators and elevators here henceforth replace movement, but also and above all designate themselves as new reflexive signs and emblems of movement proper. Here the narrative stroll has been underscored, symbolized, reified, and replaced by a transportation machine, which becomes the allegorical signifier of that old promenade we are no longer allowed to conduct on our own. This is a dialectical intensification of the autoreferentiality of all modern culture, which tends to turn upon itself and designate its own cultural production as its content." End of quote. Jameson's principal point is that in postmodern architecture, as it is epitomized in Portman's iconic building, the body is forced into heightened mobility alongside with the infinite mobility of other signs and semiotic structures that define the space. But the trajectories and pace of this movement are always already prescribed by automated devices that carry the body. It is no longer the body that organizes its own perceptual space and maps itself onto it, but the space that carries the body through and within it and maps cognitively the body's position in a mappable external world. The implications of this disjoining are much more profound than simply the relationship between the body and the built environment. What is at stake is a production of the subjectivity within this newly networked hyperspace, and which reflects the incapacity of our minds, at least at present, to map the great global, multinational, and decentered communicational network in which we find ourselves caught as individual subjects.
The topographical approach to images as material sites demands that the site writer investigates the positions she occupies in relation to images, the locations these images are inscribed in and referred to, and the spatial issues they raise, not only conceptually and ideologically, but affectively and materially, in order to write texts that locate the spatial themes triggered by an encounter with images in written form. Not only the beholder, the writer, positions herself and her body in relation to images, but the ways in which images are positioned become significant. It is almost like the objective chance of the surrealists, an operational détournement of discovering the marvelous, a predetermined contingency that cannot happen otherwise, but does not have to happen. One has to find it. According to Jane Randall, site writing or topography is a constant move back and forth between the inside and the outside, the images with which the writer engages invite her inside, but also define her as always already external. Writing images as sites is to enter a labyrinthine maze where the narratives are placed inside one another and where one is to get lost. Site writing defies the art historical approach for the truth of the referent and resemblance, and bypasses the architectural and temporal coordinates of the mausoleum, museum, in which images are fixed and the space is preconfigured. The domain of the images is the reign of the Minotaurus that traps the one attempting to enter the maze of interlacing spatialities. Here I am not offering a reading of images that provides a rational explanation for their iconography, catalogue stylistic references, or attempts to locate internal truths, but I'm proposing to spend a lifetime before images, the way in which Joseph K. spent a lifetime before the law. But instead of a spent lifetime, I'm proposing an exegesis that opens up the images to a multiplicity of meanings, but also towards the impossibility of knowing, that defies the myth of their omnitranslatability.
Narrative painting has been one of the greatest casualties of the 20th century. First, it was overcome by modernism as a vestige of the Ancien Régime for the sake of the painting's triumphant reduction to the physicality of the medium, as the culmination of its teleological evolvement. Then it was deconstructed by postmodernism because of its ideological connotations, and has rarely marked a comeback under post-medium conditions. In her recent book, Under Blue Cup, Rosalind Krauss attempts to salvage the medium as technical support by those practitioners who reinvent it in the post-medium oblivion brought about by installation art and the institutional critique of the white cube. Several years ago, Krauss underwent extensive mnemonic therapy to relearn to connect signs with signifiers after aneurysm, a condition when an exploded artery launches a cataract into the brain, disconnecting synapses and washing the neurons away. Taking this recovery as a metaphor, she argues for the memory of the medium as a set of rules, a unified discourse for a given period that is both recalled and reinvented. Unlike the Greenbergian formalist reductionism of the medium to the physicality of its support, Krauss asks the question of the who you are of the medium in terms of technical support. I quote, "I'm substituting technical support for the traditional idea of the medium. Technical supports are generally borrowed from mass cultural forms like animated films, automobiles, investigative journalism, or movies. Hence, technical replace the artisanal materials of the guilds." End of quote. Krauss's Knights of the Medium include Ed Ruscha, whose technical supports are automobiles, William Kentridge, whose elaboration of animation by means of painstaking erasure recalls the memory of the medium, and Harun Faruqi, who foregrounds the video's editing bench, amongst others. But ultimately, what is at stake for Krauss is to salvage the visual from its obliteration by those practices that harness a fundamental distrust towards the ontology of the medium. If the technical support is the discursive unity of a given epoch, the way in which the checkered board served as a support for the Renaissance linear perspective in a sense of providing a set of rules, laws, conventions. So can landscape become such a support for narrative painting in the post-medium condition? Can the narrative be told through the very materials that it inhabits? Kasper Kowitz's work constantly weave a single narrative. However, this is a narrative that has a multiplicity of paths and a variety of stories, depending on which path the beholder takes. It is like in a fairy tale where the protagonist faces several paths and has to choose one based on pure chance or intuition. Here, rational choice is of no help, but the paths chosen are those that lead to a manifest destiny. Kowitz's landscape paintings and three-dimensional works that support these narratives, however, are not about a story. They are a story. One could call them surviving images that carry the memory of the medium and yet reinvent it with their latency and tenacity. The various narrative paths that one takes in these landscapes are trails in dense forests, footprints on ice lakes, tracks in abandoned gardens, and roads in villages trodden by those who pursue manifest destiny or no one at all. In Ice House, which is an action-based work from 2010, the landscape literally becomes a support structure that sustains the pencil drawings graphed on the wall during Kowitz's 2-week stay in a trailer on an icy lake in Canada, but also literally bears the artist's life supports, the ice house and his own body. I'll just play a few segments from the documentation of this performance.
passion. For the sake of his sorrowful passion. Eternal Father, I offer you the body and blood, soul and divinity of your dearly beloved Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. For the sake of his sorrowful passion. For the sake of his sorrowful passion. For the sake of his sorrowful passion. For the sake of his sorrowful passion.
Kamp Auschwitz. Onder de aanwezigen geen vertegenwoordiger van de Nederlandse overheid. In een vilijne ogen.
Dat die zouden leiden is pertinent een onjuist verhaal. Dat is flauwekul.
Hans Reveld, boswachter in de Oostvaardersplas.
Van alle kanten op. Bijvoorbeeld die laatste wildkampioenenboek, die won ik. Je krijgt toch een enorm stuk motivatie. Ja, ik ben er daar zo lang mee bezig, dus ja, ik voel me wel erg goed. Opbrenging van Posma, heel goed plezier zit. 23,85 voor Posma zit. Wat een fantastische opbrengst. Als je dit vol kan houden, beste opening van de dag. 500 was misschien eigenlijk meer favoriet dan 1000. Ja, ik was 1500, was ik echt favoriet. En dat was bij mezelf was dat ook zo. Ik wist dat ik de 1500 meter goed kon.
Kovitz's landscapes of memory are punctured or zipped through by an intrinsic element. But before that, here the relationship in this work between Kovitz and the landscape is one of trust. But the danger of trust and the danger of the medium specificity are, as Cavell tells us, inherent in the experience of art and the experience of inhabiting the present. So those landscapes zipped through by an intrinsic element are an element that is ejected out of the landscape that belongs to it. The tension between a seeming harmony and its disturbance, the serenity of landscapes, and the traces of violence and history contaminating them is articulated at the level of the materials and forms. These landscapes have been violated doubly, being turned into a flat image through technical reproduction, because he always works with found photographs or postcards. They are consigned to the nomadic life of exchangeable signs, yet they also bear traces of the desire for conquest. However, there is no original innocence that they can regain. There is no purity to go back to. The series Common Prayers is based on an old postcard of Buzzard Roost, a lake in Greenwood and South Carolina. What comes first is Common Prayers, Eucharist of 2001, a pencil drawing on a dirty underbed. Here the fragile outlines of the landscape, graphed with pencil on a discarded underbed, are punctured by stains embedded within the material. These outlines carry the memory of the stain, yet they reinvent the medium through their accidental character. The artist says that he thought of the work as the tabula rasa that land takers, specifically the Puritans, hoped to find. Eucharist is referred to in its ancient Greek meaning of thanksgiving, but also as a religious term for the most significant magical transformation around which the rite of a mass is centered. But this tabula rasa revokes the object, as it has been already stained by those sleeping on the underbed. This is followed by Common Prayers, Recreation, which is a failed attempt at reconstructing the landscape in its three-dimensionality. The final piece in the series, Common Prayers, All the Friends I Have Had Are Gone, transfers the outlines of the landscape onto cut-out, preformed polyethylene that forms a pond. The matter contained within the curvilinear frame becomes a negative image of the photograph of the original landscape. The pond is punctured by a hole that serves as the punctum of the image. I'm talking about this. Yet, belonging to it, yet creating a caesura within the still recognizable form of the landscape. As yet another attempt at recreating the landscape in its three-dimensionality, the work moves further away from the found postcard. The landscape, rather, is no longer represented, but becomes a technical support that precariously holds the forms together. Kovitz claims that there is an obviousness that signifies a state for him, where the closer one gets to the recreation, to recreating the original, the further one gets away from it at the same time. He quotes the poet Philip Larkin, who, when answering the question, "What have you learned from the poets?" in an interview for the Paris Review in 1982, replies, "Not to be afraid to be obvious." Kovitz further states that in Merriam-Webster dictionary, the obvious has two meanings. The first one is the archaic usage of the word, being in the way or in front and only. And the second one is easily discovered, seen, or understood. And he says, "I kept and keep revisiting this poetic scar in my work, and it holds a fascination for me, but also comes with a sense of dread, of utter departure, of reaching an end and feeling the cold of utter loneliness." Hence the title, "All the Friends I Ever Had Are Gone." In Never Sink of 2011, the actual landscape of Never Sink Dam in New York goes through a multiplicity of dimensional transformations in such a way that it no longer reproduces the Cartesian coordinates, even in its three-dimensional spatialization. Kovitz chooses a postcard of the dam, the three-dimensional geography rendered as a reproducible two-dimensional image in the postcard, then transfers the outlines of the landscape back onto the third dimension. However, this double translation betrays the actual landscape as a referent, since the work that emerges is a maze of discrete lines, a result of tracing, both in a sense of technical tracing, but also in a sense of an index, a trace. These traces, these lines, they envelope the viewer's body, which here in a funny way in this 3D reproduction, computer reproduction, is North Korean dictator Kim Jong-il's body. The doubly transformed three-dimensionality appears as a strange, vertiginous and dazzling image, since it both promises reconstitution of the familiar spatial coordinates, but then withdraws this promise. The rigid frame supposed to provide a support structure, a grounding to regain the Cartesian coordinates, clashes with the intensity of the moving lines that run through the unyielding outlines as its electrified nervous system. Rate Your Progress is based on a reproduced image of a jungle in Vietnam, cleared due to a fallen bomb. The forest that would otherwise see no light becomes an index in the three-dimensional rendering of the image where the referent collapses. What is left is the experience of the place, an experience that has not been lived. The 6 constructed walls cannot contain the matter violently, puncturing the walls and aggressively threatening the viewer's entry. Kovitz uses post-painterly materials to make paintings. Fox's urine, bear scat, pine sap, another pine sap, and coffee, amongst others. But these materials carry the traces of narratives in them, or rather they are paradox materials, since they point at a referent that has escaped, as if going out for a walk and never returning. They function as indexes pointing at a story that has disappeared, as if in a crime scene. Here the story is not to be found behind the painting, but in the opacity of materials, as visually transparent as this might seem. The promise of the transparency of the sign, as providing a key to decoding the painting, runs against the opaque materiality of the image, but often the paradox materiality of the landscape as technical support. Through its thickness, but also elusiveness that conceal the image from immediate visibility. Thus, the beholder has to pull the image out of its latency so that it enters to the domain of the visual. This visuality in turn is haptic, in that the viewer's body brain is activated in the process of materialization of the image by pulling it out of its latency. The landscape as technical support holding the precariousness of the image that is yet to materialize, but at the same time is on the verge of collapse. This requires that the viewer gets closer to the painting to penetrate its materiality. So in a way, the viewer is compelled to visually crop the image, and as we know from Lacan, gaze is there is violence embedded in the gaze. So this cropping requires this exercise of violence, which also runs in a kind of dialectical tension with the desire to get the full picture. And this is, in a way, doubly violent because the landscape has already been framed for us. Framed in a sense of technological framing, but also in a sense of visual framing, of optical framing. And I was going to end with a quote by Georges Didier Huberman, which I lost, which is a good thing, so we can end here. Thank you.